room here. And I'm Tamas Sekeli. I'm actually a professor at Bath, and it looks that I'm also a professor here. So, Narhulan just reminded me that we met actually a long time ago, 2014. So some of you may not have been born at that time, so this is when the T-Rex field. Actually, I'm just writing a paper on T-Rex parental care. So, but it turns out that T-Rexes have about 2.5 kilos babies. Of course, plovers are the most wonderful organisms, but one of my colleagues are interested in Tyrannosaurus Rex is the official name. He was a big beast, actually, 2.5 kilos baby. He was already killing other lizards and other T-Rexes as cannibals, it's another name. So I think now, 2014, I gave a presentation at the Beijing Normal University, and after a presentation, a bright and enthusiastic student who actually worked on panda came to me, and he just explained, his dream is to go to America because America is such a fantastic place, and he wants to continue his research with pandas, sexual being. I don't know whether you know that the panda how they pee, the pandas. I mean, you want to get into the details of it. Anyway, so the pandas are wonderful creatures, actually, of course, and one of the few successes in my whole career is I managed to come with this young gentleman to come to Bath and do a PhD actually on plovers, and off we go. And I'm very glad that he's here, and it looks that we continue working on a number of issues. So many thanks for Nar coming and presenting your work. Hopefully there's no embarrassing slides of me. No? So go ahead, otherwise I will stop it.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for the brilliant introduction, and thanks for organizing this event. As Thomas just mentioned, as Thomas mentioned, I'm born and raised in Xinjiang, China, which is the biggest province and also the westmost province in China. And
it's bigger than Tibet.
It's the biggest one. Yeah. So there are 46 different groups of ethnic people living in that region. So China, to many people, is actually more culture diverse than a lot of people would think. So I'm one of these ethnic groups called Kazakh, which is the same group of people from Kazakhstan. So if I have to say two things about Kazakh, one is of course eagle hunter, and the other one probably is Borat, brilliant film, but I'm not sure if it's culturally accurate. Growing up in a nomadic culture, so it's really hard not to be an animal lover. So that's why I decided to study wildlife and conservation in a city called Harbin in northeast China, somewhere here. And then after 4 years, I went to Beijing, as Tamas said, study animal behaviors in giant panda. Where I met Tamas and made this probably the best decision in my life so far to study PhD in shorebirds in the UK.
Will you say it when I'm not here?
Of course, it's a different version. Different version, of course, but so over the past 4 or 5 years, I've been doing field research in different places. But the main research site has been in Tibetan Plateau, where I studied 2 different plover species over there. So today I'd like to talk about some of the work that I have done during my PhD, as you can see from the title, Making System Variation in Relation to Disease Biology in Charadrius plover. And this whole PhD project was supervised by Professor Tamas, Dr. Ben Ashley from University of Bath, and Professor Liu Yang from Sun Yat-sen University in China. So if time allows, hopefully I can also briefly talk about the research I am doing at the moment after I graduate. So let's get down to business. So we all know Charles Darwin. He's the first person, 150 years ago, proposed the concept of sexual selection, which opened up a new era, of course, for evolutionary biology. And in his book, he mentioned sexual selection as the males of almost all animals have stronger passion than females. Hence, it is the males that fight together and display their charms before the female. So put it in a simple word, sexual selection is the competition of same sex for mating opportunity, either by force or by just being glamorous, like beautiful feathers. So over a long time, a lot of species, they came up with different adaptations. The most well-known example probably are the sexual side dimorphism in elephant seals, or these beautiful ornamentations in peacock. So this sort of adaptation not only refined in morphological traits, but also led to some sex differences in breeding behaviors. So by breeding behaviors, I mean like different taxa, they have, or different species, they have different strategies to, when it comes to looking for a mate or providing care for the offspring. So you can see from this pictures here, those sort of mating behaviors and the parental behaviors, they show huge variation across taxa. So in some species, like the bird of paradise up there, you can see they use this beautiful dance and feathers to attract female, whereas some other species, they do this fierce fighting with one another. And when it comes to parental care, some species have both male and female, like biparental care for the offspring, and some other are, uniparental care, where only one parent providing care for the offspring. And among the uniparental care, there are some really bizarre examples. I don't know if you haven't seen these pictures before, but this is the water bugs. So it is a father that carries all his broods wherever he goes. So these are the broods. And of course, in some frog species, Bosch definitely know that there's some breeding called gastric breeding, so where the mother would have the pre-juvenile stage of the offspring in their stomach, and at some point, when it's developed to some point, it will be expelled from the stomach. So all these mating and parenting behaviors are so variable across different taxa. That's why people came up with a concept called sex role to understand this sort of interesting behaviors. So a lot of research, of course, has been done to understand the sexual evolution, and one of the commonly accepted is this framework called it shows how sex role evolved from anisogamy, which means different gamete size in males and females. So basically, we all know that males produce zillions of sperms, and females have a limited number of eggs throughout their lifetime. So that makes males and females have different reproductive potential, which kind of cause a biased operational sex ratio in the population, which means there might be often more males that are sexually active than female that are receptive. So in this case, male would be becoming a competing sex, competing for the limited resource, which is the female. And female becomes like choosy sex. So that leads to these typical sex roles in many species, but it's not entirely the case, because in some animals, some species, we know that there are things called sex role reversal. Yeah, but this is like just a general pattern across many taxa. But of course, more recent study, they start looking at some other factors or predictors that influence their sexual evolution. For example, in this framework, people propose that the ecological environment, such as the spatial and temporal distribution of a resource, or the social environment, such as adult sex ratio and predation, they all somehow influence or shape different mating strategies and parental care across different species. And moreover, some more recent study shows that there are this kind of interaction between these two components, mating strategy and the parental strategy. Just like the hands up there, one is drawing the other, so this kind of feedback relationship between these components, which makes this whole story becoming more interesting or more complicated than we thought. So that's why, based on these theories, I started my PhD study, and I chose shorebird because shorebirds, as we all know, they are quite highly diverse in terms of breeding behaviors, including mating system and parental care. So from this study, you can see some of them are polygamous, showing those red branches, and some are monogamous in gray branches. And in terms of the mating parental care, you can see they have a full spectrum of different parental care types. So from pig-headed snipe, it's male-only care. From oystercatcher, biparental care. And in some rough species, it's a female care only. So that makes them an excellent organism to study. And as a matter of fact, in the past few years, our team produced some work trying to understand sexual evolution in shorebird species, in plover species. So, for example, in this study, they looked at how parental care is predicted by ambient environment. So, it's a multiple population project, and they found that when the ambient temperature or the surrounding environment is more harsh, that will make a male to put relatively more effort than the population who is from a much more mild environment. So basically, males are doing more job in terms of parental care when the wet environment is harsh. And in this study, they looked at the mating system and the adult sex ratio variation across different plover populations and how they influence their parental care. Based on this current framework of theories, and also the study has been done, we can see some part of this framework has been tested, as is shown in these green arrows. But however, some of those relation hasn't been tested or has not been fully tested, as you can see from this. Oh, it looks brown here, but yeah, these orange arrows. So based on this, with the help of a lot of people, Tomasz, András, a lot of good colleagues, we created this my PhD research framework, which aims to look at the possible predictors that are related to the mating decision process in shorebird populations, and also trying to see what are the implications of different mating decisions across plover species. So my PhD study produced 4 pieces of work, and I'm going to briefly introduce these works. And the first one, we started with a single population called snowy plover. It is a close relative to Kentish plover until a few years ago it became classified as a distinct species. And this population is from North and Central America. They have quite flexible polygamous mating system, which means males and females, they both might have several breeding attempts within a season, and either male or female, they will desert and remate with a different or the same individuals within the population. So the data was collected from a site called Ceuta in Mexico from 2006 to 11. And I like this video. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the shorebird's fieldwork methodology, but I just like to briefly show you how the fieldwork is like. So in the field, we search for nests like this, and we wait for one of the parents to come back up to sit on the nest. So when we find a nest, we record the nest location, and measure the egg size, and do a lot of data collection. So when the bird is back, we sort of put a trap on the top of the nest, wait for one of the parents to return to incubate the nest. So once the bird goes into the trap, we just go straight and capture the bird. Just wait for it. Because this is a really time-consuming part, because sometimes the bird couldn't find the entrance. So we just walk around. It will take some time, yeah. So the moment the bird sat on the nest, we're just going to run to the trap and capture the bird. Yeah. So basically, this is what's it like. So once we capture the parents, we're going to ring the parents. That's how we get the data of their pair bound. So we know who is the father, who is the mother, and some species some individuals they might have multiple nests. So you will get like multiple pair bound data, and by comparing those pair bound data, we can see if the individual has changed the mate or not. So it's a mate fidelity and divorce that we're looking at. And then after the parents are captured, we're still running a little bit of nest monitoring to understand what the fate of the nest. Is it predated? Is it hatched? Or is it disappeared? Just to know what's going on with the nest. And after that, based on how many eggs hatched, we can calculate or estimate the reproductive success of an individual by counting how many hatchling an individual had. So based on all these data, we had 2 main findings from this study. So first of all, as I said earlier, this species is polygamous, but to expand our understanding of this species, it is the female who is more, showing lower mate fidelity rates. So you can see it's a significant difference between males and females. Apparently, it is a female in the field that initiate the divorce and leave the parental care for the males. So this is what we see in snowy plover, and we try to link it with the nesting success within the population, and we found something quite interesting, because apparently in snowy plover, when the nest is successful, the parents are more likely to divorce, which is very opposite to those traditional, or the most commonly accepted theory that divorcing birds are mostly caused by breeding failure. But apparently this is quite opposite in snowy plover. Why that is, I'll explain the mechanism later. So to understand this interesting pattern, we expanded this research to a multiple population level. So we included 8 species and 14 different populations across the world. And based on the same variables we collected for the first study, we actually collected a few more predictors for this multi-population study. So we collected environmental variables such as temperature and the precipitation, and also some life history traits, for example, body size, sexual size dimorphism, and trying to test the same set of questions. So first of all, apparently, different plover populations, they show variable mate fidelity rate. So some population can be, low mate fidelity rate, there are a lot of divorce happening, and some population could be, very monogamous and they keep mates throughout the whole season. And this is the same case for males and females. And when we correlate their mate fidelity rate with the temperature, we notice that the population from a warmer environment, they tend to have a lower mate fidelity rate compared to the population from a cold environment. And we're trying to understand why that is. So one possible mechanism is that, in a warmer environment, let's say temperate zone or tropical zone, the environment is mild, so food abundance is much better than the cold environment. So, the individuals, couples have a longer breeding season compared to those from, let's say, Arctic. So the longer breeding season allow them to have a multiple breeding, which means there might be divorce or mate retention happen compared to those populations from Arctic. So this, like a mechanism we're trying to propose here, is actually supported by one of my field work in Tibet, in Qinghai Lake. So these are two populations I'm looking at. But if you look at this next picture here, it is late May. It's supposed to be very warm. It's supposed to be summer, but in Qinghai Lake, you can see the temperature is -7. So in this environment, you can see the father is still baking the eggs. But throughout the 2 or 3 years of monitoring, we notice in both of these species, there's no mate change so far that we observe in the field. So because it's cold, so there's a very short breeding window for these species. So they cannot really afford a second breeding. So if you think about it, if those birds from Arctic, it's an even cold environment. So they have a really short breeding window that cannot make the multiple breeding happen. Right? So, again, we did the same. We correlate the mate fidelity rate with nesting success rate. We found a similar pattern that the successful mating tend to result in a lower mate fidelity rate. So there are two possible mechanisms after quite a few discussions, although we haven't really tested those mechanisms yet. So one is the time constraint. So for species like plover, they're small. They have a high mortality across between years, and so one possible way to improve their reproductive success is by multiple mating. Just mate as fast as you can, mate as much as you can. So in this species, one sex would tend more likely to leave the time-consuming parental care to the other sex. So this sex can start looking for new mate and initiate more breedings. But of course, which sex, male or female, is the deserting sex, or who initiate the divorce is totally, partially determined by adult sex ratio, which is also the most important piece of puzzle in this whole system. Because if it's a male-biased adult sex ratio, which means female have more potential mates after divorce, so in this population it's probably the female that is going to more likely to divorce after the successful breeding. So these are two mechanisms we propose in this study. And furtherly, we try to compare what would happen after different mating decisions. So we looked at the reproductive success and the breeding dispersal. And of course, we found that after divorce, those divorced individuals, male or female, they tend to have they're significantly successful when it comes to reproductive success, which totally makes sense because after divorce, when they divorce, it's usually because their last breeding was quite successful. So after divorce, they can initiate another breeding attempts really fast, so that will result in more hatchlings, which is totally fine. But when it comes to breeding dispersal, we can see that female disperse slightly, significantly further compared to male. It doesn't matter if the male is divorced or retained. So the explanation behind this is probably, in many plover populations, we presume that it's male bias adult sex ratio, which means female have a slightly higher remating opportunity compared to male after the first breeding attempt. So, female after divorce will fly around in a further distance to look for new mates. Whereas male, like in many other species, they're more territorial. They will defend their territory, and also some of them are stuck with their children, so they just have to be around with the chicks. So that's why they have a slightly smaller breeding dispersal range. So it's important to know from this study what we found so far is correlational patterns. It not necessarily mean it's causal. So we need to do a lot of experimental study to test those mechanisms we propose in this study, especially the role of ASR. This is what we are trying to do for the next step. So till now, it's the first half of my PhD. We try to look at the mating system variation or mating decisions across different plover populations and trying to understand the possible predictors that cause different mating strategies. So what's next? So the second half of my PhD is trying to look at those implications of different mating systems or mating strategies. So one of the possible avenues to look at is actually disease transmission. So like in the first half, we look at how MSS ratio and mating system interacts. And if you look at these figures here, it's quite interesting. So this is a social contact network from this kitless plover population in Madagascar. And this is a social contact pattern in this white-fronted plover in Madagascar. So what's the difference? Kitless plovers, they are polygamous. And white-fronted plovers, they are monogamous. So you can see the intensity or the frequency of their social contact is very different. So apparently, the polygamous, they have more social contact, it's mating, it could be some other social behaviors. But apparently, if there was a pathogen transmitted through this network, you can definitely expect very different patterns when it comes to these two different populations, right? So that's why we're trying to see. So this probe kind of explains how mating system is related to disease transmission dynamic, especially STD. And then we're trying to link these two components, how adult sex ratio is linked to STD transmission dynamic. And of course, from this past pandemic, we all know, we learned that a lot of disease or virus, pathogens, they work differently in males and females. So for example, in COVID, we found that the symptom is much more severe in male compared to females, and more males died from COVID compared to females. So that means that disease characteristics, such as transmission rate or mortality rate, is different between males and females, which will cause, of course, sex-biased mortality in many populations. So we're also trying to link these two components. I mean, it's quite obvious, obvious relations, but nobody actually tested it. So we used the mathematical modeling to test those two possible questions. I don't want to bore you with these equations, but I'll just make it simple. So within the population, there are basically two groups of individuals. One is the susceptible ones, and the other is infected individuals. So the susceptible individuals, they are determined by how many of them were born, minus those ones who are infected, and minus those ones who are died from natural cause, and plus those ones who actually recovered from infection, right? So the infected individual, they are determined in the same way. So a number of infected individuals minus those who died from natural cause or caused by those disease, and minus those ones who were recovered and went back, and goes back to the susceptible group. So based on these two equations, we set two different scenarios. So the first scenario is when there are no sex bias in disease characteristics, which means the transmission rate and the virulence of disease is equal in males and females. So what you can expect from our finding is that if you look at A and B, you can see as the alpha is the mortality virulence of the disease. So as alpha increase, or beta is transmission rate, as alpha decrease and the beta increase, you can expect the prevalence is increasing, which totally makes sense, because if you think about this Omicron variant, right? So the mortality rate caused by Omicron is decreasing, but at the same time, the transmission rate is increasing like crazy. So this is exactly what we actually see in the past few months, right? And what is more interesting about this is like that if you look at this figure, these dots means the equilibrium of the disease prevalence. You can see the less common sex actually higher STD prevalence. So when the population sex ratio is let's say between 0 and 5, which means it's a female biased population, then you can see disease transmission rate prevalence is much higher in males compared to females. This is actually tested by a lot of other theoretical studies. The possible explanation is that less common sex in the population, they might have a higher chance of, let's just say, has more sexual partners. So they have a much more frequency of contacting or contracted disease compared to the common sex in the population. And you can see, it doesn't matter if alpha or beta change, you can see the peak of prevalence shifts as alpha and beta changes from A and B. I mean, C and D is not quite useful in here. So the second scenario is like when disease characteristics are sex biased, so alpha and beta are not necessarily equal in males and females. So how did we do it? We fixed alpha F and beta F, and we changed the alpha M and beta M. So, I'm going to explain this figure a little bit. So the general pattern, as you can see, when the transmission rate increase or the mortality rate decrease, you can see the prevalence is actually increased, which is consistent with this figure, except that this pattern is not symmetrical. Because in the previous figure, you can see in males and females they're symmetrical, right? It's exactly the same. But in the next one, the pattern is not necessarily symmetrical. It's quite arbitrary, in my opinion, because I couldn't find a real pattern in there. And the greater the transmission rate increase, you can see the peak where the sex ratio, where the prevalence peak is shifting towards a greater sex ratio. And this change is more pronounced in female. So as the transmission rate increases, you can see the sex ratio where the prevalence peak is shifting more like to male bias in female. You can see the change. It's more pronounced in female, and it's similar. It's the same logic to the mortality rate. So you can see the change is more pronounced in males. But I mean, this is a quite complicated pattern. But what I'm trying to say is that from this study, it doesn't matter how complicated the pattern is, but what we prove is that there is a complex interplay between population sex ratio and disease characteristics, and they together affect on the STD prevalence. So without modeling, we probably couldn't even know this kind of influence can be non-symmetrical, right? So this is a possible what is happening behind this whole thing. So adult sex ratio, they probably will lead to different mating opportunities in males and females, and that will cause sex bias transmission rate, of course, to some extent. And because the virus or pathogens works differently in males and females, that might cause sex bias mortality within the population, which will eventually change the adult sex ratio of the population. So the next one, after we get this model, it logically makes sense to test these models using field data. So ideally, we should collect some disease like STD samples from populations of shorebird populations, but unfortunately, we have very limited knowledge on plover disease biology. So we decided to start from zero. So we were thinking gut microbiota could be one possible direction to look at, because in birds we know that their cloaca have a dual function. So what's inside the gut microbiome could possibly be pathogenic and transmitted through sexual contact between individuals, right? So we decided to look at gut microbiota from the samples we collected from Qinghai Lake, from Kentish plover and lesser scent plover. We used the 16S RNA sequencing technology to look at bacteria composition from the gut microbiome. So we're aiming to, first of all, it's quite basic, just getting some baseline information of the gut microbiota from plover populations. And since it's like two comparison different species, we're trying to see if the role of genetics, social link, or environment in shaping their gut microbiota composition. But the importance of this study, of course, as I said earlier, it has disease implications because some of those bacteria composition could be pathogenic, right? So here's what we found. This study is still in progress, so I can only show you some what we got so far. So even though the individuals showing different gut microbiota compositions, but when you put them together, you can see it's quite similar. So basically, 3 different bacteria phylum, they account for nearly 90% of the total microbiota compositions in both Kentish plover and lesser set plover. And we looked at if there are any differences in terms of like families in general in 3 different comparisons. So we actually find something. So these different families, they are more abundant in lesser set plover than Kentish plover. And within Kentish plover, so I forgot which is male or female, but definitely some of these families are more abundant in males or females. Like there's a sex difference in terms of these families, and of course between adults and juvenile as well. However, when we're doing some alpha and beta diversity within this comparison group, unfortunately we didn't see any significant difference between their diversity in terms of between sex, between age, and between species. Probably because we just didn't collect enough sample to get a more robust result, or there might be something that is not correct when we're collecting the fecal samples, because shorebirds is not like duck or geese. You can collect a big chunk of fecal samples in the field. They're so small, so collecting the fecal hasn't been easy, to be honest. So yeah, we're still trying to come up with a better solution for this. So in the future, hopefully, for this study, we're trying to expand the research scales by including as many populations as possible from different ecological settings, so we can link gut microbiota with their different social structures. So, we said that there are different variations in terms of mating behavior and parenting behavior across different populations. So it would be interesting to look at if their gut microbiome would differ as well with their social structures. And most importantly, as I said, to understand the function of the different bacteria, gut microbial communities, and looking at the pathogenic function of these bacterial groups. And of course, apart from bacteria, we can also possibly look at the viruses within the samples using metagenomic sequencing technology and kind of thing. So eventually we can try to link the social structure with their disease prevalence as the model predicted. And all we have been doing is ultimately trying to reach the goal of conservation in shorebirds, so to make sure they survive better in the field. So this is exactly what I have done throughout my PhD. And of course, as I said, the implication of conservation biology, we're trying to contribute to the survival of the species. So with this knowledge learned and gained during PhD, I started one of this current research with the help of a local collaborator in South Africa and Kamash, of course, and the Alvanol people. We set up a new study site in South Africa, north of Cape Town. It's a really nice population in the site to study shorebirds. So there we found this, my personal favorite plover so far, chestnut-banded plover, which is a nearly threatened species. So we're trying to use this technology, monitoring their breeding behaviors, and also do a little bit of a gut microbiome study to evaluate their conservation status, and also come up with the possible advice for their future survival. Because you can see within the site, you can see the egg in the middle of the road, crushed by the trucks, of course. Yeah, so it's a quite interesting place to look at. And the second current research I'm doing at the moment is in collaboration with Dr. Wojta and Professor Tamash to expand what we have done in the second project to understand the mate fidelity in shorebirds, but including more populations, because Alvanol over the past few years has collected a lot more data from different populations. So we're trying to include as many populations as possible, and also incorporate some more components, for example, parental care, LSS ratio from different populations, and trying to understand the mechanism behind the mating decisions in different plover populations. And possibly we can apply it to some other organisms as well, like frogs, probably. So yeah, as I said, I started from panda as my research, which is mammals, so I decided to shift a little bit back on the mammals again, which is human. So again, it's still within the same research framework of adult sex ratio. So one of the current research I'm doing is to look at the adult sex ratio in some human society, let's say, phenomena. For example, the first one is human society social norms. So when we're talking about social norms, it means a shared standard of acceptable behaviors by groups. So when the social norm is stronger, that means people have a lower tolerance for those inappropriate behaviors. So this sort of response is quite different from country to country depending on where you're from. So for example, I'll make a really extreme example. Like in a lot of the Arabic countries, females has to wear, cover their head. If they don't, it will not be widely accepted by society, which is totally opposite in Europe. So this is something I'm trying to look at. And by analyzing some basic data, we found something really interesting. So we tried to correlate adult sex ratio of the countries with their social norm strengths. And we found as adult sex ratio becoming more male biased, we can see the social norm strength is increasing across the country. So one possible mechanism is that in the society, males are more likely to commit punishment to those inappropriate behaviors. So imagine a society with more males, they're more likely to punish those inappropriate behaviors. So this is a mechanism we're trying to test. But of course, this study is still ongoing. And another aspect of human research...
Can you just go back?
Yeah.
Obviously, you can test it because you have to, the possible mechanism is specific. So you would expect that if there is a question about female behavior, how many boys you had some fun recently, then this would be correlated with ASR. But the question like, if they ask the boy, how many girls you have recently fun with, it will be no correlation. So I think you can distinguish if you have specific questions which refer to male behavior, acceptance of male behavior, and acceptance of female behavior.
Yeah, it's definitely a good point. But when it comes to we actually were in the middle of testing several mechanisms. We got something, but I just haven't got a chance to.
It makes good sense. Men are nasty. That's a fundamental idea.
Yeah. So the second branch of this human study is to look at how adult sex ratio may influence or related to human marriage behaviors. So I don't know if you guys heard about the term called kidnap marriage. So it's kind of marriage practice in many countries in Central Asia and some part of Africa. So a girl walking on the street could be easily kidnapped by a man and brought back home and get married. So a girl can marry someone who she never met before in her life. So this kind of cultural practice, in our opinion, of course, we call it detrimental. Or marriage practice, but it's quite a Eurocentric opinion because this sort of marriage practice hasn't existed in some part of the world for a very long time. So we're trying, but a lot of study has been done to understand this sort of marriage practice from economic, from culture, from many social aspects. But nothing has really been done from evolutionary point of view. So there must be a reason behind it why it coming to be in the first place. So this project is about trying to link adult sex ratio of society with those marriage practice. So our study site will be Kyrgyzstan. So I went briefly to the site not too long ago to understand what's going on there. But apparently that's the reason why I'm saying we say it's a detrimental culture practice, but in their opinion it's not. It's just part of the culture. So I think sometimes we just.
So what's the good thing in it? I just can't see it.
Because I'm trying to put it in an evolutionary perspective. Because if you think about cost and benefits of those marriage practice, from a boy's point of view, he invests nothing. Because what he has to do is just go kidnap the girl and come back home. He doesn't have to pay anything. But from the girl's point of view, she is actually losing let's say. Cost a lot because but so what's the mechanism to compensate for that? If you look at it from the sexual conflict point of view, So this is something we're trying to
But
test.
what's the rationale? So what would they say? You know, Kyrgyz, what do they say? Oh, somebody just stole my daughter.
Yes.
Such a brilliant thing to do.
Again, but the interesting thing is like the girl has a chance to, or had a choice to leave the family. But there's a sort of very interesting social norms there that the boy's mother usually, she's an elderly person, she would lie in front of the girl, but in their culture, stepping over a senior person is a big disgrace.
Yeah.
So that kind of made the girl had no choice but stay.
But
So-
again, this is a force by a grandmother or whoever is woman.
Yeah.
Side. So it's not very nice. So it's not no.
But yeah, we're trying to look at the bigger picture here.
Yeah,
So
of
we're
course.
thinking like, what is the benefit for the girl? So one possible thing I'm thinking at the moment, I haven't tested yet, but is like, for example, like of course the girl is kidnapped to a family, and just accepted, and the girl's family will go to the boy's family, like negotiating,
Okay.
and probably the boy's family will pay a amount of money to the girl's family. So if you think about it, I mean, the benefit probably is not going via the girl, but the money goes to the boy's family, and the boy's family might have the girl might have a brother, younger brother, older brother, so he can benefit from this amount of money. I mean, this is just one possible thing I'm trying to put together, but
I think just one idea now. It would be good to know more about the actual what's happening. Okay, of course, this is how you describe. This is how I'm sure it is how Ruth described that. But it would be good to know that of the last 100 or whatever number of women kidnapping, how many happened this way?
yeah, oh yeah.
Or
So,
were there some interactions previously, not just random?
yeah, we're just trying to collect as many, because this thing has been put into legislation, which is totally illegal in this country at the moment. So in a young generation, there's a very few cases of kidnapped marriage, but in the older generation, it's quite common. So we're trying to take advantage of these existing participants to sort out these interesting evolutionary questions. So yeah, this is pretty much the end of my presentation. I mean, the whole thing has been done with the support of a lot of people. I'd like to thank personally, of course. And these studies has been supported and funded by different research grant source, University of Bath, Chinese Scholarship Council, etc. And thanks for attention. I'm ready for questions. Thank you.
Questions, go.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. I was wondering whether when you analyzed mate fidelity, was this separate from brood desertion? So did you only consider biparental families, or mate fidelity also included the deserting partner?
So yeah, it included the desert partner as well. So basically, first of all, when we talk about mate fidelity, it's usually, it doesn't make sense to separate the male from females, right? But when it comes to the analysis, you would realize we don't really know who in the sex that initiated the divorce. So basically, that's why we separate the males and females, and we look at them separately. But of course, it also includes those one who deserted their brood as well. I mean, in some cases, the nest is just gone, eaten by a fox or something. They divorce, but we put all these events together into our categories.
It would be interesting to see whether your results remain the same if you exclude desertion and you only consider these possibilities,
Exactly.
when the pair has a chance at least to remain together.
Exactly. But that means that we have to refine the field data to distinguish from
But you can argue that actually brood desertion is part of whether you stay with your family or not, it's part of mate fidelity. So a reason why you stay and look after the baby, because you actually don't care about the kids, you want to keep the girl or the boy.
Of course, but that's part of a divorce. But I think that, for example, when you analyze breeding success, that's a completely different story. If you analyze when basically they just divorce and then switch partners, but they're at the same breeding stage, because when desertion happens, when the partner who leaves the family already, has a big advantage, because she or he can start a new family, and therefore that mate fidelity is related to breeding success is not so surprising if desertion is also included.
Yeah.
But it would be very interesting to see whether the same results holds if you exclude desertion from
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. Yes.
I think it's a good point. The trouble is that very few people follow a breeding attempt. So what we tend to see that you have the family records. So who was the male, who was the female in nest 1, nest 2, nest 2, nest 3. From this is what NAR did. You can filter out the repeated nests where the male and the female were identical or not. Okay? This is mate fidelity. But to get brood desertion, you actually need a lot more detailed observation several times during because you want to make sure that they were there on day 2, day 5, day 20. And for vast majority of populations, we just don't know. But anyway, no, I see the concept, and I do agree. Yeah, it would be nice to.
So 2 questions with your microbiome study. So if I understand it correctly, you want to compare the microbiome of individuals as a measure of their mating relationships.
Yes.
So as a positive control, I would expect that social pairs, so the ones that are mated with each other, would be more similar to each other. Have you tested that?
Exactly. And also, we haven't tested that, to be honest. Well, there's things like we need, first of all, analyze their social structure data for sure. Like we have to know if it's a male, if it's a female, the family composition as well. Then we need to compare those microbiome compositions within the family, and from the family, from close next to the family, from the same region, probably from different sites. But that's the idea we're trying to do. We just have to look at it.
Why not cloaca swabs instead of
So that's a very tricky thing because Plover is really small. Any sort of cloacal collection is quite invasive to the bird. That's number 1. And second, we tried cloacal swab as well, but the DNA concentration from the sample is just incredibly low. For at least for 16S RNA sequencing. I don't know what's going to happen if we do the meta-genomic sequencing, but for 16S. Yeah, so the concentrations, we tried, so we found that from the fecal sample is much more.
Maybe you should try with the larger one.
But yeah, it's just collecting the fecal sample from these tiny birds has been, it's nightmare.
I know some people who collected this kind of data, they didn't do cloacal swab, but actually they use a pipette and kind of flush out get much more.
Yeah. Because what we found in the field is quite interesting. Interesting that when the bird is within a trap, they are really scared and they actually poo right above the nest. So you have to wait really long time before the bird poo again. So you see, there's
the problem with the fecal sample is that it depends on quite a lot on the diet of the animal. So.
From the general pattern you can see, these are probably not quite convincing, but these are 2 sympatric species, so we kind of expected that they might have quite similar composition in terms of biology. But as a comparison, if we look at the same species, different population at a different site, and compare these 2, there might be something interesting to look at. So we're aiming to collect. That's why aiming to collect samples.
It would be interesting to talk to bacteriologists, so somebody just look to see whether some of these bacteria are infectious.
Actually, yes. Sorry, I forgot the name of these. These purple ones. Oh no, not purple. Sorry, the brown ones on the top. Yes. So they are pathogenic from some of the.
But the question is whether it's pathogenic in the stomach or
yes,
in the stomach. Sexually.
It's in the stomach, we don't know if it's transmitted through sexual contact.
You have to go to the toilet or you want to have a
good time. But from within the family contact, we probably expect something pathogenic that transmitted through family members, father to kids, kind of thing. But we just need to find out the best predictors for those pathogenic bacteria.
Okay. Oh no, go. No, go.
I was also interested, you mentioned the intensity of sexual selection and these differences in the mate fidelity across different populations. And I was wondering whether you guys ever checked the differences in male coloration back in the dinosaur times that Tamás mentioned, I also worked on coloration and public.
Yeah, actually, we have a group, like collaborator working on that. But I don't know if we get some solid results from that.
Zitan quantified, but if you want to, we can give you about 10,000 wonderful images. It takes about 2 weeks to download from Naerhulan, and you can have a very good time.
But yeah, if you had a chance to visit the Chinese population, you will see
that's
that the
better,
male
even
population
better.
they lost the catch-up here and so on. So because I collected samples. Yeah, but we still haven't got any.
I think the short answer is that there was somebody, Zitan, a Chinese postdoc, who did have a look at it. But there is a manuscript from this, but this was only on the Chinese population. So if somebody is interested in coloration, some of these photos are actually raw images, so it's actually as good as it can get, not all of them.
Yeah, but I mean, even if you don't have a very detailed analysis, you know, sometimes you can just see the difference clearly if there is one. So in populations when there is a very high sexual selection, males might be just brighter than in other populations where, you know, the sexual selection might be. So I don't know if you guys have
No, there are photos. Yeah, the team members do collect these photos.
But
of course, you just go back to catch-22. So how do you know how strong is sexual selection? Yeah. But I think now I just realized that we can tell this from genomes because it's directional selection, So this is what Case is doing. So we can actually say that, well, you have to think about color genes, ornamentation genes, and then you expect that in a more colorful populations that there was stronger directional selection. This is testable, and we actually will have the genomic data. Yeah, that's a good, good thing. Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Okay, more questions? Yeah, no? Everybody's sleeping. Okay.
I would just have a final comment, comment based on this kidnapping.
Oh yeah, sure.
You mentioned that this is a frequent thing in Kyrgyzstan, but not really in Europe. Actually, it depends on when you look at it. So
at some point,
the famous, it's part of the Roman mythology.
Yes, actually, I heard the story yesterday.
The abduction of Sabine, I don't know if I pronounced it well, Sabine women, which was a mass abduction that Roman men went and then just kidnapped a bunch of young women, and that's
Actually, you have to go back so much in time. My grandparents married like that. I was present in Hungary as well.
And also, I think it's kind of correlated with the lifestyle. For example, it's more common in nomadic cultures compared to agriculture, way of living. So, yeah, it's just quite interesting to.
But of course, it's a very different thing whether people did it and whether this is actually, well, adaptive is a strong wrong, but it's actually good for the girl. It's just very difficult to see, for me at least, why would this be good for a girl to be stolen? Yeah.
But like when we were interviewing some people, a couple, the women who was kidnapped back in the old times, and I mean, some of them are really, just like relaxed about talking about this after 30, 40 years.
Well, of course, because they had no more choice, you just imagine.
So, yeah, thanks, Adam.
Anyway.
Thank you, guys.